The sun was already a tyrant over Silver Creek, beating down on the dust of the main street until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. From the small window of her bedroom, Alara watched it rise, a merciless eye in a bleached blue sky. The heat was a physical weight, pressing in on her, no different from the silence in the house or the whalebone corset that was already digging into her ribs. Her wedding dress, borrowed and yellowed with age, lay across the bed like a shroud. It was too tight in the shoulders and too long in the hem, a garment meant for a woman who had lived and died a generation ago. When she put it on, she felt like an imposter in her own skin. She ran a hand over the brittle lace, the fabric whispering under her touch. Today, in this dress, she would cease to be Alara Vance. She would become Mrs. Blackwood, another fixture in the judge's grand house, polished and silent and set upon a shelf. Downstairs, she could hear the low murmur of her parents' voices. She did not need to see them to know the expressions they wore. Her mother's face would be a mask of strained composure, her eyes shadowed with a pity that felt worse than scorn. Her father's would be grim, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of their failing home. They were good people, trapped by a bad turn. The silver vein they had sunk every last dollar into had run dry, leaving them with nothing but debt and the cold judgment of a town built on the fortunes of others. Judge Blackwood's proposal had not been a kindness. It had been a bill of sale, their salvation in exchange for their only daughter. Alara closed her eyes, and the judge's face swam into view. He was not a monster in the way stories told of them. He was a man of cold, unyielding granite. She remembered the town picnic last spring, how his hand had rested on the small of her back, a proprietary gesture that lingered too long and felt as cold as a stone through her dress. She remembered the way his eyes, the color of a winter sky, had assessed her, not with affection but with the detached appraisal of a rancher checking the teeth of a mare he was about to purchase. And she remembered the whispers, the stories that clung to him like the dust on the courthouse steps, stories of his first wife, a fragile woman who had withered under his care and died of a fever that came on conveniently and left just as quickly once she was in the ground. To marry him was not just to enter a loveless union. It was to be erased. She would be consumed by his wealth, his power, his coldness, until the girl who dreamed of teaching children their letters and reading books under the shade of a cottonwood was nothing but a ghost haunting a fine house. The terror of it was a living thing, coiling in her stomach, stealing the very air from her lungs. Across town, in the sweltering heat of Judge Blackwood's stables, Liam was mucking out the last stall. The air was thick with the smell of horse, hay, and manure, a familiar trinity that he preferred to the cloying scent of perfume and judgment that drifted from the main house. He worked with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, each pitch of the fork precise, each step silent. He was lean and wiry, built of sinew and quiet endurance. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, a gift from his Shoshone mother, framing the high cheekbones and the startlingly pale eyes of his Irish father. He was a man of two worlds, and welcome in neither. "Hey, Breed," a voice drawled from the stable door. It was Jed, a beefy ranch hand with a mean streak as wide as the valley. "Hurry it up. Judge wants his stallion ready for the parade after he's hitched." Two other hands, lounging in the shade, snickered. Liam did not turn. He kept his eyes on his work, his face a stoic mask. He had learned long ago that to react was to give them a victory. His stillness was his only armor. "Can you believe it?" Another one piped up. "Old Blackwood's finally getting himself a new filly. Heard this one's barely 18. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Prettier than the last one. I'll give her that. But just as breakable. I reckon the judge likes his horses tame and his women quieter." Their laughter was a coarse, ugly sound that scraped at something deep inside Liam. He had seen Alara Vance in town, walking with her mother, her head always slightly bowed. He saw the sadness in her eyes, a look he knew all too well. It was the look of a caged animal that has forgotten what the wild even looks like, but still feels the ache of it in its bones. The men's lewd jokes about her, about what the judge would do with his new prize, filled him with a quiet, impotent rage. He drove the pitchfork into the soiled hay with a sudden, contained violence, the muscles in his back cording with tension. The bell of the Silver Creek church began to toll, a flat, joyless sound that echoed off the mountainsides. Liam finished his work, his movements as silent and deliberate as ever. He was supposed to stay with the horses, but a strange compulsion pulled him toward the sound. He needed to see it for himself, to witness the final closing of the cage door. The church was small and stuffy, suffocating under the midday heat. The air hung heavy with the scent of wilting wildflowers and the thick perfume of the town's most pious women, a smell of sweet decay and hypocrisy. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood stood at the altar, a monolith of smug satisfaction in his fine black suit. He was a big man, his presence seeming to suck the very light out of the room. When Elara appeared at the end of the aisle, a hush fell over the congregation. She walked on her father's arm, a small, pale figure lost in the folds of the borrowed dress. Her face was as white as the lace at her throat. She felt like a ghost at her own funeral, drifting through a crowd of strangers who had all come to watch her be buried. The weight of their gazes was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. Her eyes, wide with a blind, silent panic, scanned the faces of neighbors, of merchants, of people she had known her whole life, and saw nothing but idle curiosity. And then her gaze locked with his. He was standing at the very back of the church, half hidden in the shadows by the door. His presence so unexpected it was like a jolt. It was the judge's quiet stable hand. She had seen him before, a spectral figure who moved at the edges of town, always alone, always silent. But now, in his steady, unreadable gaze, she saw none of the pity or morbid fascination she saw in every other face. She saw no judgment. In the depths of those startlingly pale eyes, she saw a flicker of something else, something she could not name. It felt like understanding. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible connection, but in the dry tinder of her desperation, it landed like a spark. The preacher's words began to drone, a meaningless river of sound that washed over her. Each phrase, each prayer, was another nail being hammered into the lid of her coffin. She stood beside the judge, close enough to feel the cold radiating from him, to smell the faint, cloying scent of bay rum. She could feel his ownership settling over her, a heavy cloak she would never be able to shrug off. And if any man can show just cause, why they may not lawfully be joined together. Let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. A profound silence fell upon the church, broken only by a cough from the back pew. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She saw her future laid out before her with horrifying clarity, a life of silent servitude in a house that was not a home, of enduring the judge's cold ownership day after day, year after year, until she withered away into nothing, just like the woman before her. Through the tall, arched window to her left, she could see the jagged peaks of the mountains, their slopes covered in sage and juniper, their summits reaching for a sky that seemed impossibly vast and free. The wildness of it called to her, a promise of a freedom she had never known, a life that was her own. The choice solidified in her mind. It was not a coherent plan, not a thought-out strategy. It was a primal, instinctual scream from the deepest part of her soul, the need to run. In a single, fluid motion that shocked the entire congregation into a collective gasp, Elara lifted the heavy hem of her dress, turned, and bolted. She ran down the aisle, her borrowed shoes slipping on the polished wood. Shouts erupted behind her, her mother's cry, her father's shocked oath, the preacher's sputtering disbelief. She burst through the heavy oak doors and into the blinding furnace blast of the afternoon sun. She did not look back. She ran with no destination in mind, her only thought the desperate, all-consuming need for escape. The chaos she left in her wake was immense. Judge Blackwood's face, moments before a mask of smug satisfaction, contorted into a vision of pure, unrestrained fury. The public humiliation was a brand on his skin. He took a step down from the altar, his voice a bellow that shook the rafters. "Get her! Somebody get her! Sheriff, I want my men! Bring her back!" Liam, standing at the back, was the only one who did not seem surprised. He watched the flash of white as she fled down the dusty street. Her movements panicked but surprisingly swift. He saw the men pouring out of the church, their initial shock already turning to the cruel excitement of a hunt. They were grabbing rifles from saddle scabbards, rushing to untie their horses. He knew these men. He knew the casual brutality they were capable of, the relish they would take in running down a terrified girl. He knew what they would do to her when they caught her, and that the judge would allow it. In that instant, a decision he did not know he was capable of making took hold of him. He was a man who survived by being invisible, by never getting involved. But watching her run, seeing the posse form, something inside him broke its chains. He slipped out the side door of the church, his movements as swift and silent as a shadow. He ignored the judge's fine, grain-fed horses. Instead, he made his way behind the stables to where his own mount was tethered. She was a lean mare, a Mustang cross with a wary eye and a tough spirit, a horse as much an outcast as he was. He swung into the saddle. He was not joining the posse to hunt her down for the reward or for the judge's favor. He was going after her to make sure she survived. Ilara's flight into the wilderness was a brutal awakening. The freedom she had glimpsed through the church window was a harsh and unforgiving reality. Her impractical wedding dress, a symbol of her gilded cage, was quickly torn to shreds by the grasping fingers of sagebrush and the sharp edges of rock. The thin satin shoes, meant for walking down a church aisle, were destroyed within the first mile, offering no protection from the thorns and hot, rocky ground. The landscape itself was an antagonist. The vast, sun-baked expanse of canyons and thorny scrub stretched in every direction, a deadly and indifferent beauty. She was a creature of the town, of soft hands and sheltered rooms, completely unprepared for the elemental truth of survival. Thirst came first, a raw, scraping feeling in her throat. Then came exhaustion, a leaden weight in her limbs. The scale of the wilderness was terrifying. Every ridge looked the same, every dry wash a dead end. Within an hour, the town of Silver Creek was completely swallowed by the horizon, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Liam tracked her with an ease that would have horrified her. Her path was a clumsy, obvious scar on the land, a trail of torn white lace snagged on branches, panicked footprints in the dust, a broken stem of rabbit brush. He kept a careful distance, staying downwind, using the rolling terrain to remain unseen. He moved through the landscape not as an intruder, but as a part of it, his skills honed by a lifetime of needing to be invisible. From a high ridge, he felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the judge's posse thunder off in the wrong direction. Their loud shouts and bumbling efforts a testament to their town-bred arrogance. They were looking for a prize to be captured, not a soul to be saved. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple, Ilara's body gave out. She stumbled and fell, crawling the last few feet to a small outcropping of rocks that offered the illusion of shelter. She curled into a ball, her body trembling with exhaustion and the first chill of the coming night. Liam watched her from a ridge above, a silent sentinel against the darkening sky. He knew she would not survive the cold night without water. Her strength was gone. Waiting was no longer an option. Under the cover of the deepening twilight, he circled around, his mare picking her way silently through the rocks, while Ilara was huddled in a fitful, exhausted sleep. He dismounted and crept toward her shelter, He placed a small canteen of water and a strip of dried venison on a flat rock near her head, then melted back into the shadows as quietly as he had come. Ilara awoke in the dead of night. The world was black and cold, and a shiver racked her entire body. Her throat felt like it was coated in sand. Her thirst was a screaming, primal need. As her eyes adjusted to the faint starlight, she saw it, the dark shape of the canteen, the strip of meat beside it. Her first reaction was a jolt of pure terror. Who left it? Was it a trap? One of the judge's men toying with her before dragging her back, but her body's desperate craving overruled the fear in her mind. With a trembling hand, she reached for the canteen. The water was cool and clean, and as she drank, it felt like the most exquisite relief she had ever known. She tore off a piece of the jerky and chewed it slowly, the salt and protein sending a sliver of strength back into her depleted muscles. She did not understand where the offering had come from. Was it divine providence or a secret pursuer, one whose motives she could not begin to guess? Whatever the source, it was the first fragile glimmer of hope she had felt since she burst through the church doors. She realized she was a fugitive in a world that wanted her captured, a speck of dust in an immense and dangerous wilderness. Yet someone or something was watching over her. The high, lonesome cry of a coyote echoed from a distant ridge, and the night was filled with the rustles and sounds of unseen predators. For the first time in her life, she felt a freedom so absolute it was indistinguishable from terror. For 2 more days, the grim ballet continued across the sun-scorched earth. Ilara pushed onward, driven by a sheer, desperate will that surprised her, while Liam shadowed her, a ghost in the landscape. He watched her grow weaker, her steps, which had begun with panicked speed, now faltering into a weary shuffle. He saw the fire of her spirit burning low, and a cold fear, something he had not allowed himself to feel for years, settled in his gut. He continued his silent, invisible support. One morning, she awoke from a fitful sleep to find a small, wrapped bundle on the ground beside her. Inside was a piece of flint and a shard of steel. The gift terrified her as much as it helped, a sign that her pursuer was not just following, but anticipating her needs. The next day, another canteen of water appeared near a spring she had been too exhausted to notice. These acts of support kept her alive, but they also deepened her confusion, twisting hope and fear into a tight, unbearable knot in her chest. The landscape was a relentless thief, stealing pieces of her with every mile. The sun burned her face until it was a raw, peeling mask. The sharp rocks and thorns shredded the soles of her feet, leaving bloody prints in the dust. Her fine wedding dress, once a symbol of her bondage, was now a collection of filthy rags held together by a few stubborn threads. But the wilderness, in its cruelty, was also a harsh teacher. She was being stripped of her former self, the pampered, useless daughter of Silas Vance. She learned to read the sun to find her way west, away from the life she had fled. She learned that the shade of a juniper tree was a more precious commodity than gold. She discovered how to find pools of cleaner water in the hollows of rocks after a rare night's dew. The girl from Silver Creek was being scoured away, and in her place, something harder, something more resilient, was being forged in the heat and the dust. On the 3rd day, the bleached blue sky turned traitor. Dark clouds, the color of a fresh bruise, boiled over the western mountains, rolling down the slopes with an ominous speed. The air grew still and heavy, and a sudden, bone-deep chill replaced the oppressive heat. The first clap of thunder was a cannon shot that echoed through the canyons, and then the sky opened up. Rain came not in drops, but in a solid, driving sheet. The temperature plummeted. The dry gullies and washes she had been using for cover turned into raging, muddy torrents in a matter of minutes. Ilara was caught in the open, with no tree, no overhang, nothing to offer shelter from the deluge. The cold, driving rain soaked through her thin rags instantly, sapping the last of her strength. Her body, already depleted by days of hunger and exhaustion, could not fight the cold. A violent, uncontrollable shiver seized her. Her teeth chattered. Her limbs grew numb. She stumbled, her legs giving way, and collapsed in the thick, red mud, the world dissolving into a gray, roaring blur. Her body gave up the fight. This was the moment Liam had been dreading. He could no longer remain a ghost. To stay hidden now would be to watch her die. He spurred his mare forward, his face grim against the lashing rain. He found her curled into a tight ball, half submerged in a muddy pool of water, her skin a shocking, waxy pale and her lips the color of faded lavender. The shivers that racked her small frame were so violent they seemed as though they would shake her apart. He swung down from his horse, his movements swift and sure. He gathered her limp form into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and wrapped her in the dry wool blanket he always carried behind his saddle. He had to get her out of the wind. He had to get a fire started. He had to save her life. Ilara awoke to the hiss and sputter of a small fire. A blessed, impossible warmth was seeping into her bones, chasing away the deep, aching cold. She was wrapped in a coarse, dry wool blanket that smelled of horse and wood smoke. For a moment, she thought she had died, and this was some strange, quiet afterlife. Then her vision cleared, and she saw him. A man sat across from her, his face cast in the shadows thrown by the flickering flames. He was silently feeding small, dry twigs into the fire, his movements calm and deliberate. It was the ranch hand from the church, the silent man from the judge's stables. Terror, cold and sharp, sliced through the warm fog in her mind. It was a trap. He had captured her. He was one of the judge's men, merely waiting for her to regain consciousness before dragging her back to Silver Creek, back to the public humiliation and the cold fury of the man she had fled. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She scrambled away, kicking off the blanket, trying to get to her feet, to run, but her legs were useless, buckling beneath her like wet paper. She fell back against the damp rock wall of the shallow cave he had found for them. Liam remained perfectly still. He did not move towards her, did not even look up from the fire. He gave her the space she so desperately needed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, a quiet rumble that did not seem to belong to the chaos of the storm still raging outside. "Be still," he said. "You will hurt yourself." "Stay away from me," she hissed, her voice a raw, hoarse whisper. "Where are the others? Is the judge coming?" "There are no others," he said, finally raising his head. In the firelight, his pale eyes seemed almost to glow. "I am not here to take you back." She stared at him, her mind reeling, unable to process his words. What are you doing here? You followed me." "I saw you run," he said simply. "I saw the posse forming. I followed to help." Ilara's fear was quickly being replaced by a deep, biting suspicion. It made no sense. "Help me. You work for him, for Judge Blackwood. Why would you risk everything to help me?" She pushed herself up, fueled by a surge of desperate anger. "What do you want? The reward money? Is that it? You mean to sell me back to him yourself?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It was not anger, but a profound and weary sadness that seemed to settle deep in the lines around his eyes. "There is no reward that would make me do that," he said, his voice firm, quiet, and utterly convincing. "He will not have you." His denial, so simple and absolute, began to chip away at the walls of her fear. She saw no lie in his face, only a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to mirror her own. He reached for a small pot resting on a hot stone near the fire and poured a steaming liquid into a tin cup. He held it out to her. "This will help," he said. "It is just broth, roots, and some dried meat." She stared at the cup, then at his face. Her body screamed for the warmth and sustenance he offered. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. Her mistrust was a loud, frantic voice in her head, but the primal, desperate need of her own body was louder. Slowly, hesitantly, She reached out and took the cup. The hot tin warmed her frozen fingers. She brought it to her lips and drank. The warm, salty broth was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It spread through her, a life-giving heat that chased away the last of the shivers and quieted the panic in her soul. He watched her drink, his expression unreadable. When the cup was empty, he spoke again. "We cannot stay here. The posse is still out there. They will be searching this whole area once the storm breaks." He looked out at the gray, weeping sky. "I know a place. An old line cabin, hidden deeper in the foothills. No one has used it for years. It is our only chance of shelter." She looked at him, this strange, quiet man who was both her captor and her savior. She had no reason to trust him, and every reason to fear him, but she also knew he was right. She would not survive another day in the open. She had no food, no proper shoes, no knowledge of this land that was trying so hard to kill her. She had no choice. She gave a single, small nod. The journey to the cabin was an agony. The storm had passed, but the world was a sodden, muddy mess. Elara's weakness was profound. She could barely walk a dozen steps without stumbling. More than once. Liam had to lift her into his arms and carry her across a swollen creek or up a slippery, mud-slicked embankment. This forced physical proximity was both awkward and deeply intimate. She was acutely aware of the strength in his arms, the steady beat of his heart against her ear, the quiet way he breathed as he navigated the treacherous terrain. He was strong and capable, and his knowledge of the wilderness was a quiet miracle. He moved with a silent grace, his feet seeming to know exactly where to land. He pointed out plants, telling her which roots were edible, which leaves could be chewed for thirst. He showed her how to walk on the balls of her feet to make less noise. When he saw her wince with every step, he stopped, gently took her foot in his hand, and applied a poultice of chewed herbs to the bloody sores, the touch of his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. As he worked, she began to see past the silent, stoic exterior she had first encountered in the church. She noticed the careful, deliberate way he moved, as if he were trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. She saw a sharp intelligence in his pale eyes as they constantly scanned the horizon, reading the landscape like a book, and she saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his mouth, lines that spoke of a grief that had settled into the very grain of his being. During their slow, arduous journey, they began to share pieces of their lives. The conversation was stilted at first, filled with long silences broken only by the sighing of the wind through the wet pines. Elara, her voice still hoarse, found herself haltingly explaining the full story of her family's debt, of the suffocating pressure from her parents, of the chilling emptiness she felt when she looked into her own future as the judge's wife. She spoke of her lost dream of being a school teacher, a dream that had seemed so small and trivial to her family, but had been the whole world to her. Liam listened without judgment, his gaze steady on the path ahead. When she fell silent, he, in turn, offered fragments of his own story. He spoke of his father, an Irish trapper who had loved the wildness of the mountains and taught him how to read the stars. He spoke of his mother, a Shoshone woman who was a healer, who had taught him the names of the plants and the ways of the land. He did not speak of how they died, but he told her of the constant, grinding feeling of being an outsider, of carrying the blood of two peoples and belonging fully to neither. He described the casual cruelties he had endured his entire life, the way people in town would either look straight through him as if he were air, or stare at him with a mixture of suspicion and hate. Elara began to understand that his silence was not a sign of simplicity, or of a slow mind. As the other ranch hands believed, it was a shield, a fortress built stone by stone over a lifetime of hurt. They finally reached the cabin late the next afternoon. It was a small, dilapidated structure nestled in a grove of aspens, barely more than a hovel. The roof sagged in the middle, and the wind whistled through the chinks in the log walls. But to Elara, after days in the open wilderness, it was a palace. It was shelter. It was 4 walls and a roof. a definable space in a terrifyingly vast and indifferent world. A powerful sense of partnership grew between them as they worked to make it habitable. He used his knife to cut pine boughs and, with mud from the nearby creek, patched the worst of the holes in the roof. She found a stiff branch and swept years of dust and leaves from the packed earth floor. They found old, overturned crates to use as a table and chairs. This shared purpose, this simple, domestic act of building a temporary home together, forged a new kind of bond between them, one built not on desperation, but on mutual effort. The cabin was tiny, and their forced proximity was constant. They were always in each other's space, their lives suddenly and completely intertwined. One evening, while trying to pry open a stubborn crate, Alara reopened a cut on her forearm. Before she could protest, Liam insisted on cleaning it. He gently took her arm, his touch sending an unexpected jolt through her. With a clean strip of cloth dipped in boiled water, he washed the wound, his movements focused and careful. Then, he tore a length of fabric from the sleeve of his own worn shirt and bound the cut with a surprising tenderness. His touch was respectful, almost reverent, devoid of the ownership she had felt from the judge or the clumsy fumblings of boys at church socials. It was the first time in her life a man had touched her with simple, selfless kindness. She felt an unfamiliar blush creep up her neck, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the small fire crackling in the stone hearth. She looked up and saw him watching her, a flicker of something deep and intense in his pale eyes. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and then he looked away, retreating back into his guarded silence. A few days later, the fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered. Liam had taken to scouting from a high ridge that overlooked the valley, his eyes always scanning for danger. He returned to the cabin one afternoon just as the sun was setting, his face grim. He did not need to speak. She saw it in the tight set of his jaw, in the way his eyes had gone distant and cold. He had spotted them, a group of riders in the distance, sweeping the area systematically. Just as he had feared, they were still far off, a day's ride at least, but they were methodical. It was the judge's posse. He did not tell her immediately, not wanting to add to her fear, but the unspoken knowledge hung between them like a shroud. The world was coming for them, their small, patched-up cabin, which had begun to feel like a home, was suddenly a trap once more. Their sanctuary was temporary, their time borrowed. The harsh reality of their situation descended upon them, making the burgeoning connection they felt feel both infinitely more precious and terrifyingly doomed. The fear of the posse was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their days, a threat that lived on the horizon. Yet, within the four rough-hewn walls of the cabin, an unlikely and strange domestic rhythm began to take root. Life was stripped down to its essential elements: warmth, water, food, and shelter. The grand anxieties of Alara's past, social standing, reputation, her parents' approval, faded into irrelevance, replaced by the immediate and deeply satisfying challenges of survival. Liam became her teacher. He showed her how to weave a snare from twine and a bent willow branch, his long, deft fingers moving with a practiced grace. Her own hands, accustomed to needlepoint and the delicate keys of a piano, were surprisingly adept at the task. He watched, a rare, small smile touching his lips, as she learned to tie the slip knot, to test the tension, to place the trap along a barely visible game trail. A few days later, when she checked her snares and found a large rabbit, a thrill of fierce, primal pride shot through her. She had provided, she had contributed. She held up the catch, her face flushed with triumph, and the look of quiet approval in his eyes was more rewarding than any praise she had ever received in her former life. He taught her how to read the signs of the land, to see the story written in a patch of flattened grass or a broken twig. He showed her which berries were safe to eat, their bright colors like jewels in the deep green of the forest, and which ones, though beautiful, held sickness within them. In return, she brought a sense of order and comfort to their small, shared space. with a needle fashioned from a sharpened bone and thread carefully pulled from the seams of her ruined wedding dress. She mended a long tear in his worn cotton shirt. She organized their meager supplies: the dried meat, the foraged roots, the small bag of flour he had been carrying, making their scant resources feel more abundant. Most importantly, she talked to him. She filled the profound silence that he had worn like a second skin for his entire life. At first, her voice was hesitant, a fragile thing in the vast quiet of the mountains. But as the days passed, it grew stronger, more confident. She told him stories from the books she had read, described the faces of the children she had hoped to teach, and shared small, simple memories of her childhood. He was a patient and attentive listener, his pale eyes fixed on her as she spoke, and she began to feel that she was not just speaking into a void, but was being truly heard for the first time. Their conversations, held in the evenings by the flickering light of the fire, became their most important ritual. The darkness outside, with its unseen dangers, pressed in on the small cabin, creating an island of intimacy. It was here, in the semi-darkness, with their faces softened by the firelight, that they felt safe enough to unburden their souls. One night, lulled by the warmth and the low crackle of the flames, Alara found the courage to ask a question that had been lingering in her mind for days. "Liam," she began softly, "you spoke of your mother and father. You said they taught you everything." He looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, his hands going still. A shadow passed over his face, and, for a moment, she thought he would retreat back into his fortress of silence. But he held her gaze, and after a long moment, he began to speak, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "They had a homestead," he said, his eyes focused on the fire now, watching the flames dance. "A few miles from here, up by a creek. My father built it all himself. He was a good man with his hands. My mother, she made it a home. She could make anything grow." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. Alara waited, not daring to breathe. "There was a rumor," he continued, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "that the creek on our land ran with color. Gold. It was not true. My father had panned it 100 times. There was nothing, but men with gold fever do not listen to reason." He described the day they came, 3 of them, gold prospectors with hard faces and greed in their eyes. They rode up to the homestead as if they owned it and demanded his father sign over the deed. Liam, only a boy of 10, had been in the woods behind the cabin, checking a line of snares. He heard the shouting and crept closer, hiding behind a thicket of wild plum. "My father was not a fighter," Liam said, his voice now a rough whisper. "But he would not be bullied. He told them no. He said the land was not for sale. One of the men, he laughed. He said the land belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it." Liam's hands clenched around the piece of wood, his knuckles white. "When my father refused again, the man pulled his pistol. He did not hesitate. The sound, it was so loud. It scared all the birds from the trees." He swallowed hard, his gaze lost in the embers. "My father fell. My mother, she ran out of the cabin, screaming his name. She ran right to him. And the man, he shot her too." He fell silent. The only sound in the cabin was the fire whispering in the hearth. Alara could see it all. A horrifying tableau burned into her imagination. The terrified boy hidden in the trees, the sudden, shocking violence, the birds taking flight against a silent sky. "I watched the whole thing," Liam said, his voice finally breaking, thick with a pain that was still as raw as an open wound. "I watched them search the cabin, turning everything over. They found nothing. They got angry, cursed my father for a liar, and then they rode away." He looked at Alara then, and the agony in his pale eyes was so profound it stole her breath. I was helpless, just a boy. All I felt was rage, a rage so big it felt like it would burn me up from the inside. He explained what happened after, how he had run to the nearest town, How he had told the sheriff exactly what he had seen, described the men's faces, their horses. The sheriff had listened, his face impassive, but the prospectors were white men, and they had their own story. A story of self-defense against a wild man and his squaw. The word of a boy who was neither one thing nor the other meant nothing against their claims. The men were never brought to justice. This tragedy was the bedrock of who he was. It was the source of his profound mistrust, his protective silence, and the fierce, unyielding sense of justice that simmered beneath his calm exterior. Hearing his story shattered something deep inside Alara. Her own problems, the arranged marriage, the lost dreams of being a schoolteacher, the suffocating weight of her family's expectations. All of it felt so small, so sheltered, in comparison to the raw, violent tragedy he had endured as a child. A wave of empathy so powerful it was a physical ache washed over her. Without thinking, she reached across the small space between them and took his hand. It was calloused and hard, but it trembled slightly in her grasp. It was a simple gesture of comfort, but it conveyed more than words ever could. Emboldened by his vulnerability, she found herself confessing her own deepest fears, fears she had never dared to voice to another soul. "I am so afraid," she whispered, her voice thick. It was not just of Judge Blackwood, or of the men hunting them. It was a fear of her own weakness. "All my life," she said, looking down at their joined hands, "I have been what other people wanted me to be, a dutiful daughter, a proper young lady, a suitable bride. I do not even know who I truly am. I am afraid that the girl who ran from that church, that she was just a fleeting moment of courage, that deep down, at my core, I am a coward." Liam turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers. He looked at her, his expression fierce. "No," he said, his voice rough but certain. "What you did, running from that church, from him, from your whole life, with nothing but the dress on your back, that took more strength than any of those men in the posse possess. They are cowards. Not you." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. For the first time in her life, someone saw strength in what she had only ever considered a moment of blind panic. To him, she was not a frightened girl. She was a courageous woman. That single, powerful validation was a balm to a wound she had not even known she carried. This exchange marked a significant shift in their relationship. The bond between them was no longer just about survival. It was about seeing and validating the deepest, most wounded parts of each other. The simmering attraction that had been a subtle undercurrent from the beginning now deepened into something more profound. It manifested in small, intimate moments that became a silent language between them. The way his fingers would brush hers when he handed her a cup of water. The way he would gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear when the wind blew it across her face. The way her hand would linger on his arm for just a moment too long when she passed him in the cramped space. There were long, charged silences where their eyes would meet across the fire, and a whole conversation would take place without a single word being spoken. The desire was palpable, a living thing in the small cabin, but it was tempered by a deep well of mutual respect and the ever-present fear of their impossible situation. A fierce, early blizzard descended from the mountains without warning. The world outside their small window dissolved into a howling vortex of white. Snow piled up in great drifts against the door, and for 3 days they were trapped, completely cut off from the world. The cabin, which had felt like a spacious sanctuary, began to shrink around them. The enforced intimacy was almost unbearable. The bitter cold forced them to huddle closer to the small hearth, their shoulders often touching, their legs brushing against each other as they tried to share the meager warmth of the flames. The constant scream of the wind outside made the cabin feel like the only safe, quiet place in the entire world. The tension between them, woven from unspoken desire and shared trauma, coiled tighter and tighter until it felt like it might snap. On the second night of the storm, it finally did. They were sitting by the fire, the silence heavy and thick with everything they had not said. Liam had just finished telling a story his mother used to tell him, a Shoshone legend about the stars. He looked at her, his pale eyes luminous and deep in the firelight, and she saw in them a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. He leaned in slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away, to turn her head, to break the spell. She did not. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She closed her eyes. Their lips were a breath apart, the moment charged with all the fear, hope, and desperate longing that had grown between them. A sudden, violent crack from outside, as loud as a gunshot, shattered the moment. They both flinched and pulled back. Startled, it was just a heavy, snow-laden branch breaking from one of the aspens near the cabin. But it was enough. The spell was broken. The moment was lost. An awkward, heavy silence descended between them. They both knew a line had been about to be crossed, a threshold they could never uncross. The fear of what it meant, of what impossible complications it would add to their already impossible situation, was too much. They retreated back into themselves, two solitary figures on opposite sides of the fire. The unspoken desire, which had been a source of warmth and connection, was now a source of tension, a chasm that had opened between them. The day after the blizzard broke, the world was transformed. It was pristine and silent, covered in a thick, immaculate blanket of snow. The beauty of it was breathtaking, but deceptive. Liam, his face grim and his senses on high alert, went out to scout the perimeter of their valley. The snow, while beautiful, was a blank page on which any story could be written, and he feared the story it might tell. He found them not 100 yards from the cabin, a set of fresh tracks, partially filled with wind-blown snow, showing the path of a single horse. The tracks led towards the cabin, paused, and then turned abruptly away, heading east. A jolt of ice-cold fear shot through him. A rider, caught in the storm, must have seen the faint wisp of their chimney smoke and come to investigate. They had been discovered. Following the tracks, his movements as silent as a hunting cat, Liam found the lone rider a mile away. The man was struggling to get his half-frozen horse to move through a deep drift. Liam recognized him. It was a younger man, barely out of his teens, who had been hired on at the judge's ranch a few months back. Liam confronted him, appearing out of the trees like an apparition. The young man cried out in terror, his hand fumbling for the rifle still in its scabbard. He was freezing, his face blue with cold, his fear palpable. The safest option, the logical option, was to kill him. A single silent arrow would eliminate the threat, would buy them precious time, would keep their sanctuary hidden. But as Liam looked at the terrified boy, he saw not an enemy, but a pathetic, freezing human being. The same innate sense of justice that had been forged in him by the fire of his parents' murder stayed his hand. Killing this boy out of fear would make him no better than the men who had killed them. Instead, he disarmed the man, taking his rifle. He unstrapped his spare blanket from his own saddle and handed it to the boy, along with a piece of dried meat. "Ride east," Liam said, his voice low and cold as the snow around them. "Do not look back. Do not stop until you are out of these mountains. If you tell the judge where we are, if you lead anyone back here, I will hunt you down, and you will not see me coming." He watched the man ride away, a desperate, pathetic figure against the vast, white landscape. Liam returned to the cabin, his face a grim mask. He knew he had made a compassionate choice, but he also knew it was a foolish one. He had not eliminated the threat. He had only delayed it. He had bought them a little more time, but he had also sent a message back to Judge Blackwood. He had confirmed that Alara was not alone, and that her protector was the quiet, half-breed man from his own stables. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. The knowledge that they had been discovered was a slow-acting poison, seeping into the foundations of their sanctuary until the very air in the cabin felt tainted. What had once been a haven, a fortress against the world, now felt like a trap. The sense of peace they had carefully constructed was shattered, replaced by a gnawing, ever-present anxiety that clung to them like the winter cold. Every gust of wind that moaned through the pines sounded like the thud of approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow that danced on the cabin walls in the firelight seemed to hold the threat of a watching figure. They started at the slightest sound, the crack of a frozen branch, the distant cry of a hawk, their bodies tensing for a fight that could come at any moment. The unspoken desire that had sparked and then faltered between them during the storm was now buried deep beneath this new and urgent tension. There was no room for softness when their survival was balanced on the edge of a knife. They knew they had to leave. The snow that had once seemed a beautiful, protective blanket was now their enemy, a pristine white page that would record their every step for a skilled tracker to read. But to leave was to plunge back into the brutal indifference of the wilderness. With no certain destination and a dwindling supply of food, the easy camaraderie they had built, the quiet rhythm of their shared life, was strained to the breaking point. It was replaced by the grim, focused silence of two soldiers preparing for a battle they knew they might not survive. Their days became a litany of grim preparations. Liam worked tirelessly to reinforce the crude snowshoes he had fashioned from willow branches and strips of hide. Ilara spent hours pounding dried venison and berries into pemmican, a dense, nourishing food that would keep them alive on the trail. They spoke little, and when they did, their words were practical. Stripped of all warmth, the north-facing slopes will hold the snow longer. We need more fat in this mixture. Did you hear that? They were a unit, but a unit forged of necessity and fear, not the gentle partnership that had been blossoming just days before. Every morning, Liam would climb to his lookout point, a black, still figure against the snow, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, his body a tight coil of vigilance. He became more withdrawn than ever before. The weight of his decision to let the young rider go pressed on him with a physical heaviness. In the long, silent hours of the night, the choice played over and over in his mind. He had chosen mercy, had acted from the core of who he was, but in doing so, he felt he had failed in his most fundamental duty, to protect Ilara. He had not eliminated the threat. He had given it a name and a face and sent it straight back to the judge. The guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth. He grew quieter, his movements becoming sharp and economical, his pale eyes constantly alert, missing nothing. He was a predator who now felt like prey, and the coiled energy within him was almost painful to witness. Ilara saw his turmoil, saw the self-recrimination that was eating away at him from the inside. One afternoon, as he was sharpening his knife with short, angry strokes of a whetstone, she came and sat beside him. The silence stretched between them, thick and cold. "You did the right thing, Liam," she said softly. He did not stop, his eyes fixed on the glint of steel. "The right thing would have been to keep you safe." "You have kept me safe," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "You saved my life, and you saved that boy's life, too." She reached out, placing her hand on his arm, forcing him to stop his relentless work. He finally looked at her, his face a mask of granite. To kill him, when he was freezing and afraid, it would have made you no better than them, than the men who murdered your parents. You are not them. Liam, you are not a killer. Her words, and the absolute, unwavering faith with which she spoke them, struck a chord deep within his wounded soul. She saw goodness in him, where he saw only failure. Her belief in him was a balm, a moment of warmth in the suffocating cold of his guilt. But it did not change the facts. It did not erase the tracks in the snow or the knowledge that was now certainly in the hands of Judge Blackwood. A moment of warmth could not stop the coming winter. It was during this period of intense, unbearable uncertainty that the emotional dam between them finally broke. A few days after the rider was discovered, a bitter cold descended on the mountains. The wind howled relentlessly, finding every chink in the cabin's log walls. The fire in the small hearth seemed to give off more smoke than heat, a struggling, pathetic flame against the overwhelming cold. They sat in their usual spots on opposite sides of the hearth, the silence stretching between them for what felt like hours, thick and heavy with all their unspoken fears. The world outside was a black, howling void, and the world inside was just as bleak. It was Ilara who finally broke the silence. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a fragile thread of sound in the oppressive quiet. "I am so scared," she confessed, her eyes fixed on the dwindling flames. "Not just of them finding us. I am scared of what comes after." Liam looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Even if we get away," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Even if we escape the judge for good, I have nowhere to go. No one. My family. They made their choice. I cannot go back to them. I have no money, no home. I am completely untethered from the world I knew." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She took a shuddering breath, and the words that came next were torn from the deepest, most insecure part of her soul. "I am a burden to you, Liam. I know I am. You would be safer without me. You could disappear into these mountains, and no one would ever find you. But I am slowing you down. I am the reason they are hunting you. I am putting your life in danger every single day that you stay with me." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "I have never been truly wanted. Not for myself," she whispered. "I was a daughter to make my parents proud, a pawn to save them from their debts, a prize for the judge to display. I was always for something, for someone else, never just for me." Her raw, painful vulnerability pierced through Liam's stoicism like an arrow. All his defenses, all the walls he had built around his heart for a lifetime, crumbled in the face of her quiet, devastating honesty. He finally opened up completely, his own voice rough with an emotion he had long suppressed. "Ilara," he began, his voice low and intense. He set aside his knife. "I had accepted a life of solitude. A long time ago, I never believed I would find a place to belong. And more than that, I never believed I would find someone to belong with." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his pale eyes boring into hers. "These last few weeks, protecting you, being with you in this cabin, it has been the most meaningful experience of my entire life. The most real." He shook his head, a fierce denial of her words. "You are not a burden. Do you understand me? You are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen a man, not a half-breed, not the judge's stable hand, not an outcast, just a man." His voice grew thick with feeling. "You called me brave, but you are the bravest person I have ever met." This raw, painful, and beautiful exchange of honesty dissolved the last of their reservations. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the pent-up, unspoken desire from the night of the storm rushed to the surface. A powerful, unstoppable flood. The awkwardness that had separated them vanished, burned away by the heat of their confessions. Liam moved from his spot by the fire in a single, fluid motion and knelt on the hearthstones before her. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. His touch was infinitely tender, a stark contrast to the rough texture of his skin. He looked deep into her eyes, and in their tear-filled depths, he saw his own profound loneliness and desperate longing reflected back at him. This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, there was no hesitation, no pulling back. The kiss was not gentle or tentative. It was a desperate, hungry, and cathartic collision. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain and a profound, unspoken understanding of each other's scars. It was a validation of everything they had endured and everything they had become to one another in this small, isolated corner of the world. It was the taste of wood smoke and sorrow, of desperation and hope. It deepened into a passionate embrace, a frantic, desperate act of anchoring themselves to each other in a hostile world that sought to tear them apart. They were two solitary souls who had found their other half in the most impossible of circumstances, clinging to each other as if they were the only two people left alive. The fire in the small stone hearth slowly burned down, the flames dwindling to glowing, pulsing embers that cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind howled its lonely, mournful song, a reminder of the cold, dangerous, and unforgiving world that lay beyond their fragile shelter. But inside, there was only the warmth of their bodies, the sound of their ragged breathing, and the profound, earth-shattering connection they had just acknowledged. Alara pulled back slightly, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at him. The firelight played across the sharp planes of his face, illuminating the intensity in his pale eyes, the sorrow etched around his mouth, the quiet strength that radiated from him. This face had become her entire world. In this moment, she saw him not as an outcast to be pitied or a savior to be worshipped, but simply as the man who saw her, the real her, the one stripped of her fine dress and her family name, the one who was both terrified and brave, in this brutal world that had offered her nothing but a cage. Claiming a single, pure moment of happiness felt like the most revolutionary act of survival she could imagine. With a voice that was suddenly steady and clear, filled with a certainty that quieted all her fears, she whispered the words that would seal their fate, an offering and a prayer all in one. "If you want me, take me now." What followed was not just an act of physical desire, but the quiet, solemn consummation of their bond. It was slow, tender, and deeply emotional, a silent conversation in a language older than words. For Alara, it was an act of profound reclamation. For the first time in her life, she was not being taken or sold or appraised. She was choosing. She was taking ownership of her own body, of her own heart, of her own destiny. For Liam, a man who had been touched his whole life only by violence or with disdain, it was an act of acceptance and belonging, to be touched with such selfless love, without prejudice or condition, was to be healed in a place deep inside him he thought had died with his parents. In the dying firelight of the isolated cabin, surrounded by a world that would see them both destroyed, two broken people found a way to make each other whole. They forged a bond in the heart of the wilderness that was stronger and more real than any law written in a courthouse or any vow spoken in a church. It was a desperate and beautiful claiming of joy in the very face of tragedy. They left the cabin at dawn. 2 days later, the world was a blinding expanse of white, the air so cold it felt sharp in their lungs, the intimacy they had shared, the fragile bubble of warmth and honesty they had created, seemed to dissolve with the morning mist. A new connection had been forged between them in the dying firelight, a bond deeper and more profound than either had ever known. But the harsh reality of their flight reasserted itself with the first crunch of their snowshoes on the frozen crust. The journey north was brutal. The initial stark beauty of the snow-covered landscape soon revealed its treachery. What looked like a solid, flat expanse could be a thin layer of snow over a deep crevasse or a tangle of fallen logs. They navigated treacherous mountain passes where the wind was a physical force, a relentless predator that tore at their clothes and scoured their faces until their skin was raw and chapped, their muscles, already weary, settled into a permanent, deep ache from the strain of constant, upward movement. The world was a vertical agony of rock and ice. Food became a constant, gnawing obsession. The land, shrouded in winter's grip, offered little. Liam's snares, which had provided for them so easily in the sheltered valley of the cabin, now came up empty day after day. The hunt for game was a daily struggle that more often than not ended in failure, the silence of the forest mocking their empty stomachs. The warm glow of the night they had shared was a memory they clung to, a secret hearth in their hearts, but it could not fill their bellies or warm their frozen fingers. The wilderness was a relentless adversary, testing their physical and emotional limits at every turn, stripping them down to nothing but bone and will. Meanwhile, in the civilized world they had left behind, Judge Thaddeus Blackwood's fury had cooled from a hot, public rage into a cold, calculated obsession. The humiliation of being left at the altar in front of the entire town had festered within him, becoming a personal affront to his authority, his name, and his very sense of order. He wanted more than just his runaway bride back. He wanted vengeance. He wanted to see the spirit that had allowed her to run broken before him. He wanted to crush the man who had dared to help her. He had quickly realized that the local posse, a clumsy collection of ranch hands and town loafers, was incompetent. They were good for chasing a common outlaw, but useless for a task that required subtlety and relentless dedication. So, the judge did what powerful men do. He used his wealth. He sent a telegram to a man in Denver, a man spoken of only in whispers in saloons and sheriff's offices, a man known only as the judge's shadow. The shadow was a legend, a chilling figure renowned for his ruthlessness and his almost supernatural tracking abilities. It was said he could track a snake over bare rock, that he could smell a man's fear on the wind. He was a man who enjoyed the hunt far more than the reward, who found a purer satisfaction in the slow, inevitable closing of a trap than in the clink of gold coins. The narrative of their flight briefly cuts to a dusty office in Denver. The shadow, a gaunt figure in a dark, worn suit, stood before a large map of the territories spread across a desk. He was a man of indeterminate age, with a face as lean and weathered as old leather, and eyes the color of a faded slate that seemed to miss nothing. He listened without expression as a clerk read the judge's telegram aloud. When the clerk was finished, the shadow did not speak of money. He pointed a long, bony finger at the map, at the mountains west of Silver Creek. "The girl is from the town," he said, his voice a dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "She will be clumsy, but the man with her, Liam, the half-breed," he looked up, his cold eyes meeting the clerk's. "His father was Sean O'Connell, the Irish trapper. His mother was Shoshone. Tell me about him." The clerk, unnerved, stammered what little he knew, that Liam was quiet, an outcast, kept to himself. The shadow listened, a flicker of something that might have been interest in his dead eyes. He was not a bumbling villain to be outsmarted. He was a competent and terrifying threat, an artist of the hunt, and he was already beginning to understand the nature of the man he was pursuing. His skill became apparent a week later. He picked up Liam and Alara's trail days after they had abandoned the cabin, long after the posse had given up and returned to Silver Creek. He found the subtle signs that Liam, in his haste, had left behind. A single, dark hair caught on the bark of a pine tree, the faint scrape of a snowshoe on a wind-scoured rock, a pattern in the way the branches were broken that spoke of a man moving with purpose. He read the landscape with an expertise that rivaled Liam's own, seeing not just where they had been, but anticipating where they were going. One afternoon, a freezing rain began to fall, turning the snow to a treacherous slush and coating every rock and branch in a thin, slick layer of ice. Liam and Alara were forced to take shelter in a narrow, dark cave system, a crack in the side of a granite cliff. They huddled together in the damp cold, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain. It was then they heard it, the distinct, metallic sound of a shod horse picking its way carefully through the rocks outside. Liam was on his feet in an instant, his hand on the hilt of his knife, his body a statue of taut muscle. He motioned for Alara to stay silent, his eyes wide with alarm. They crept to a narrow fissure in the rock and peered out. He was there, a gaunt figure in a dark, glistening oilskin coat, his face completely hidden by the wide brim of his hat. He sat atop a lean, black horse that moved with a frightening confidence over the slick terrain. He paused a mere 20 yards from their hiding spot, his head turning slowly, scanning the area. The judge's shadow. He dismounted, his movements economical and precise. He walked a slow circle, his senses on high alert, his whole being focused on the story the land was telling him. The tension in the small cave was unbearable. Alara held her breath until her lungs burned, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. Liam stood beside her, utterly still, but she could feel the violent tension radiating from him. They were certain they were about to be discovered. The man was a predator, and they were the prey, trapped in their den. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, the shadow seemed to come to a decision. He shook his head slightly, as if concluding the freezing rain had washed the trail clean. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion and continued on, his dark form soon disappearing into the gray, misty curtain of the storm. The near-capture incident shook them to their core. The close brush with that silent, menacing figure left a residue of terror that clung to them long after he was gone. The constant fear, the gnawing hunger that was their constant companion, and the sheer physical exhaustion of their journey began to fray their nerves raw. One evening, huddled together for warmth under a miserable lean-to they had built from pine boughs, their frustration and fear finally boiled over. Alara had struggled all day to keep pace, her legs trembling with weakness, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The feeling of being weak, of being a liability, had been growing in her for days, and now it spilled out of her in a torrent of bitter accusation. "You regret it, don't you?" she said, her voice sharp and brittle. "You regret helping me." Liam, who was trying to coax a flame from a piece of damp kindling, looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "I am slowing you down," she said, her voice rising with a desperate, wounded energy. "I see the way you look at me when I stumble. If it were not for me, you would be miles from here. You would be free. I am the reason that man is hunting us. I am the reason your life is in danger." Her deep-seated insecurity, her lifelong fear of being a burden, resurfaced with a vengeance, poisoning her words. Liam, exhausted, stressed, and still haunted by the image of the shadow, reacted defensively. Her words, though not intended as such, struck his own deepest fear, that he was cursed, that he brought ruin and death to those he cared about, just as he felt he had failed to protect his parents. "You think I'm afraid of him?" he snapped back, his voice harsh with a pain she did not understand. "You think this is new to me? You have no idea what it is like to be hunted your entire life, to have every man's hand turned against you from the day you were born." The words were cruel, and he regretted them the instant they left his mouth. They created a chasm between them, invalidating her own very real terror and pushing her away. A painful, wounded silence fell, broken only by the sound of the wind and the steady drip of water from the pine needles. They had hurt each other, using the shards of their own broken pasts as weapons. The reconciliation, when it came, was hours later in the cold, black heart of the night. Neither of them could sleep. They lay side by side, not touching, two separate islands of misery in the darkness. "Finally," Alara spoke, her voice thick with tears. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean it. I was just afraid." The small, broken words were all it took. Liam turned, and the space between them vanished. He moved closer, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. "No," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "I am the one who is sorry. What I said was wrong." He held her tightly, as if he were afraid she might disappear into the darkness. "I am afraid, too," he admitted, the confession torn from him. "I am terrified of losing you. The thought of that man, of him finding you, it is a physical pain, right here." He pressed her hand to his chest, and she could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. They clung to each other, the truth of their shared fear a bond far stronger than their anger had been. They admitted their weaknesses and reaffirmed their commitment, not with grand promises, but with the simple, desperate act of holding on in the dark. Their love was no longer just the desperate, hungry passion born in the safety of the cabin. It was being tempered in the fire of this trial, strengthened by the forgiveness they now offered each other. It was becoming a true partnership, built on the shared acknowledgement that they were both wounded, both afraid, and both infinitely stronger together. Their journey continued. but with a renewed sense of purpose. The argument and reconciliation had burned away the tension, replacing it with a seamless, unspoken understanding. They learned to work as a single unit, moving and thinking as one. Liam's profound knowledge of the wilderness and Alara's surprising resilience and quick, intelligent thinking complemented each other perfectly. One afternoon, as they were crossing a steep scree slope, it was Alara who saw the telltale trickle of pebbles from above that warned of a coming rock slide, pulling him to safety just in time. Another day, when they came to a box canyon that seemed to be a dead end, it was Liam who found a series of almost invisible handholds that led to a high, hidden path. They were no longer just a man and a woman in love, running for their lives. They were a single entity, surviving as one. One morning, after a particularly arduous climb that had lasted through most of the night, they reached the crest of a high mountain pass. Below them, the world fell away into an endless sea of peaks and valleys. The sun was just beginning to rise, setting the eastern sky ablaze with impossible colors of orange, pink, and gold. The light spilled over the horizon, catching the tops of the mountains, setting them on fire, while the valleys below were still filled with deep, purple shadows. The sheer, breathtaking beauty of the landscape, so often their enemy, was for a moment a source of profound wonder. They stood together, exhausted, battered, and half-starved, watching the dawn of a new day. In the silent, majestic grandeur of that moment, surrounded by a beauty so vast it dwarfed their own small struggles, they found a glimmer of hope. They were not just running from something, they were running towards something. The hidden valley Liam's mother had spoken of, a place of myth and memory, was no longer just a destination. It had become a promise, a symbol of the future they were fighting so desperately to build together. After weeks of relentless travel that had scoured them down to their essential selves, they found it. The promise his mother had given him as a boy was not a myth. The entrance was a narrow, almost invisible cleft in a sheer rock wall, a place a man could ride past a dozen times and never see. It was choked with overgrown hawthorn and shadow, but Liam, guided by a map etched in memory and a faith he did not know he possessed, pushed through. The passage opened into a small, secluded valley that was so beautiful it made them ache. It was exactly as his mother had described it, a place of impossible green, an emerald jewel set in the harsh gray granite of the mountains. A clear, cold mountain spring bubbled up from the earth at one end, forming a creek that meandered through a meadow dotted with wildflowers before disappearing into the rock again. The high, circling walls of the valley sheltered it completely from the punishing winds, creating a pocket of serene tranquility. It was a sanctuary, a piece of the world left untouched by the greed, cruelty, and prejudice that had defined their lives. The sense of relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, that it brought them to their knees. All the fear, the hunger, the pain, and the endless desperate running came pouring out of them in a great, shuddering wave. They fell into each other's arms, and for a long time, they just knelt there in the tall, soft grass and wept. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, bone-deep release. They had made it, they had survived. For a brief, idyllic period, they experienced a peace neither of them had ever known. The world outside, with its vengeful judges and shadowy hunters, ceased to exist. Their days fell into a simple, grounding rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. They worked from sunrise to sunset, pouring all their weary energy not into fleeing, but into building. They were creating a life. Liam, using the skills his trapper father had taught him, constructed a small, sturdy homestead against the smooth face of the rock wall at the north end of the valley. He felled pines from the high slopes, squared the logs with his axe, and notched them with a practiced, patient skill. Alara worked beside him, chinking the gaps with a mixture of mud and dried grass. Her hands, once soft and pale, becoming chapped, strong, and capable. He built a stone hearth that drew perfectly, and soon the sweet smell of wood smoke, the scent of home, perfumed their small corner of the world. Ilara, in turn, discovered a talent she never knew she possessed. In the small cloth sack she had salvaged from her ruined dress, she had painstakingly carried a handful of seeds, corn, beans, and squash, taken from her mother's kitchen in a moment of desperate, hopeful foresight. She chose a patch of sun-drenched, loamy soil near the spring and turned the earth with a sharpened stick. She planted the seeds with a reverence that was almost a prayer. Her connection to the rich, dark soil grounded her, and as the first green shoots pushed their way toward the sun, she felt a joy so pure it was a physical warmth in her chest. She was not just taking from the land, she was nurturing it, and it was nurturing her in return. This section of their story was quiet and domestic. A gentle interlude focused on the small intimacies of their life together. They learned the landscape of each other's habits, the way he grew quiet and still when he watched the hawks circle overhead, the way she hummed softly to herself when she worked in her garden. They shared quiet jokes, their laughter a new and beautiful sound in the valley. They found a deep and abiding comfort in the simple routine of their days. The deep, jagged scars of their pasts began to heal, the raw wounds knitting over, replaced by the quiet joy of a shared future. They were not just surviving anymore, they were living. But the past has a long shadow, and it is patient. The judge's shadow was not a man who gave up. He was an artist, and this hunt had become his masterpiece. Through a combination of uncanny skill, relentless patience, and a sheer, obsessive will, he had pieced together the puzzle of their journey. He found the faint trail Liam believed he had hidden in a high, rocky pass. He spent weeks thinking like his quarry, understanding the man who was both Shoshone and Irish. A man who would seek shelter not in a town, but in a place whispered of in the legends of his mother's people. He deduced the existence of a hidden place, a sanctuary, and then he began his methodical, circular search. One afternoon, as Ilara was weeding her small garden, the peace of the valley was obliterated. A sharp, deafening crack echoed off the granite walls, and a split second later, the wooden door of their cabin exploded in a shower of splinters, a clean, round hole, appearing inches from where her head had been moments before as she'd exited. The bounty hunter had found them. The final confrontation was not a heroic Western shootout of novels and dime store stories. It was a brutal, desperate, and terrifying fight for their lives. The Shadow was a patient hunter, and he had the advantage. A repeating rifle against their single, old-fashioned pistol, and Liam's bow. Liam, knowing they were outgunned, used his intimate knowledge of the valley as his only weapon. He became a ghost in the aspens and pines that dotted the valley floor, setting crude but effective snares and deadfalls, waging a silent, deadly guerrilla war against their pursuer. Ilara was not a passive victim waiting to be rescued. The terrified girl who had fled the church in Silver Creek was gone forever, burned away in the crucible of the wilderness. She became an active, vital participant in their defense. Using her intelligence, she created diversions, setting a small, smoky fire at one end of the valley to draw his attention while Liam circled around behind him, crouched behind a wall of rock near the cabin. She reloaded the single old pistol with a steady hand each time Liam fired it, acting as his eyes and ears, calling out the hunter's position in a low, clear voice. She was fighting for her home, for her life, and for the man she loved with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. The fight raged for hours, a deadly game of cat and mouse that culminated in a close-quarters struggle near the spring. The Shadow, with a bleeding wound in his shoulder from one of Liam's arrows, but still relentless, managed to get the drop on Liam as he was moving between boulders. They collided in a flurry of desperate motion. The hunter was wiry and surprisingly strong, and he managed to drive a long knife deep into Liam's side. Liam cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and fell to his knees as the bounty hunter raised his knife for a final, killing blow, his gaunt face a mask of grim triumph. Ilara appeared from behind him, She was wielding a heavy piece of firewood like a club, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes blazing with a protective fury. She brought the log down on the back of the man's head with all the strength in her body. The sound was a sickening, heavy thud. The shadow grunted, his eyes glazing over, and he staggered, stunned just long enough for the wounded Liam to surge upward and gain the upper hand. Together, battered, bleeding, and running on nothing but adrenaline and love, they finally defeated him. The silence that descended on the valley afterward was profound, absolute, broken only by the gentle burble of the spring and the sound of their own ragged, desperate breathing. Liam collapsed against a boulder, clutching the terrible wound in his side, his face pale and slick with sweat. Just as they believed the nightmare was over, a new figure appeared at the narrow entrance to the valley. It was Judge Thaddeus Blackwood himself, flanked by two grim-faced hired men. He had grown impatient and had followed the shadow from a distance, arriving in time to witness the brutal, ignominious end of the fight. He looked at the bloody, exhausted couple, a slow, cruel sneer of triumph spreading across his face. This was better than he could have imagined. He expected to see fear. He expected to see Alara, the source of his public humiliation, break down and beg for his mercy. Instead, he saw a woman he no longer recognized. Alara, covered in dirt and the blood of their fight, moved to stand protectively in front of the wounded Liam. Her body was trembling with exhaustion, but she stood tall, her chin lifted, her gaze clear and unwavering. She was no longer the frightened, pale girl from the church. She had been forged into something new, something unbreakable. She found her voice, and it was filled with a strength of will that was more powerful than any weapon. "You have come a long way for nothing, Judge," she said, her voice cold and hard as the granite walls around them. The sneer on his face faltered. "Alara, it is over. Come with me now, and I will be lenient." She gave a short, harsh laugh. "Lenient? You speak of leniency? You who would have had me shackled to a loveless life as another one of your possessions. You who sent a killer to hunt us down like animals." She took a step forward, her eyes blazing. "You do not see, do you? You are so blinded by your own pride, your pathetic need to own and control everything around you, that you cannot see the truth." She gestured to the valley, to their small, sturdy home, to the wounded man she was defending. "You have already lost. You can never have what is in this valley. You can never own what we have built, and you can never, ever possess my spirit. That is mine. I am my own. Do you finally understand that?" Her defiance, her complete and utter lack of fear, was something his mind could not comprehend. He looked at her, standing there in her rags, fierce and unbroken. He looked at Liam, bleeding but defiant at her side. He saw them standing together, an unbreakable unit forged in hardship, and he finally understood that his power over her, the fear and duty he had used to control her, was gone forever. It had burned to ash. Stripped of his leverage, humiliated and defeated on a level so much deeper than physical violence, he was left with nothing. There was no victory here for him. Without another word, he turned, his face a mask of cold fury, and left the valley, his two hired men trailing behind him like dogs. The story concludes in the quiet, painful aftermath. Liam's wound was severe, and the following weeks were a difficult, desperate struggle as Alara nursed him back to health. Their simple homestead became a sick room, their hard-won peace replaced by the anxieties of recovery, by long nights spent boiling water and changing bloody bandages, by the constant, whispered fear that she might lose him. But through it all, their bond was absolute, a silent, powerful force that pulled him back from the brink. As Liam slowly, painfully regained his strength, they knew their ordeal was truly over. The final scene takes place months later, in the warm glow of a late summer afternoon. Liam, scarred but healed, stood with Alara at the edge of their small, thriving garden. The corn was tall, the squash vines were heavy with fruit, and the air was filled with the gentle hum of bees. The future was still uncertain. The world outside their small sanctuary had not changed. It was still a place of greed and prejudice. But here, in this small pocket of wilderness, they had built a home. They had found justice not in a courtroom or through the bloody satisfaction of vengeance, but by creating their own world, a world governed by the simple, powerful laws of respect and love. Their survival was a testament to their resilience. They were two outcasts, scarred by tragedy and prejudice, who had found in each other the strength to fight for and to win a life of their own. They stood together, looking out at their valley, not as fugitives, but as founders of their own small nation of two. Their love a quiet, enduring monument to hope in a harsh and unforgiving land. Thank you for gathering around the campfire and listening to our story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow travelers, and be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.